Okay, let me just. Okay.
For those of you who just joined, we're just going to give a minute or two just to let the other attendees give them some time to join. Hope everybody's doing well and have a nice evening. All right, just give it another, maybe half a minute or so, and we can get started. I hope everybody's doing well this evening. All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Ferguson Library. I'm Anthony Maricola. I'm the Manager of Information and Adult Services at the main branch in downtown Stanford. Tonight, we are happy to be hosting Tracy Masella. She's a licensed clinical social worker who will talk to us about the different ways that you can manage stress and anxiety. Before we start, I just want to mention a few things. We were generously awarded a grant from the network of the National Library of Medicine to host a series of programs on improving mental health and overall wellness for both adults and teens in the Stanford community. Please sign up for our weekly newsletter, view the events page on our website to see the different offerings that we're going to have upcoming. We have yoga for adults. We're going to start yoga for teens soon. Some art therapy workshops, info sessions on mental health resources, new books that we're offering in both print and digital. And in December, we're going to be distributing mental health kits. At the end of the event, a link to a survey is going to pop up in your browser. Please complete the survey as it helps us report back to the National Library of Medicine. If you have any questions during the presentation, please post them in the Q&A section, and Tracy will get to them as we go through the presentation. Tracy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Anthony, and welcome to everybody who's joining in tonight via the Zoom. We're so grateful that we have this opportunity to share some ideas with you all. So thanks for making time in your, I'm sure, busy days. So tonight we're going to talk about managing stress and anxiety. I think it's something that everybody is trying to manage these days. We certainly know from all of the research that anxiety is on the rise, particularly among adolescents. Huge increase, even started before COVID, but COVID certainly exaggerated any symptoms of anxiety or any triggers for anxiety that our kiddos were going through. Adults as well are managing levels of anxiety that are unprecedented. So I think it's amazing and wonderful and absolutely terrific that the Ferguson Library is devoting time and energy to getting information out to help us all manage what we're going through day in and day out. So, okay, let's get started. And definitely, please feel free to ask questions as we're going through, and I will, I will get to those. I want this to be a conversation among us. Love to hear myself talk, but I'd love to answer some direct questions as well, because I want this to be as helpful as possible. So we start out with the little babies, and it's all wonderful and terrific and great and low stress. And then we get into those childhood years and we start to see some of the expressions of anxiety and stress leading into those adolescent years, which can be fraught and filled with rebellion and this idea of separation and individuation, which often puts adolescents at odds with their parents as they try and form their own identity. So that by the end of adolescence, the goal is for kids to be able to say, who am I? and answer that question. Not just what do I do, what sports do I play, what school do I go to, but who am I on the inside? So that often causes some conflict as that process is happening. And then we all know that as adults, we are managing a whole ton of stress each and every day. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the brain works. I know this is a relatively complex diagram of the brain, but I'm really going to focus on two parts that are integral in our day-to-day experiences of emotions. And that the first one is this part here called the amygdala. And that is in our caveman brain. It's in the way back of our brain, and it's one of the first parts of our brain to become fully developed. So our amygdala works the same when we are a toddler, when we are an adolescent, when we are middle-aged, and when we are elderly. And the job of the amygdala is to keep us alive. That's what it does. It's kind of the gatekeeper, and it is always on the lookout for anything that might be life-threatening, has to keep us out of danger to keep us alive, and anything that might be pleasurable, because we need pleasure to survive as a species. So the amygdala is constantly scanning the environment, both internal and external, to find out if there's anything that we should be aware of. And if the amygdala senses something that it feels is life-threatening, dangerous, or pleasurable, it sends all of these neural signals to different parts of our body. And that's what we call the feelings, because we actually physically have a response to the amygdala, alerting different organs in our body. So that's when our eyes will tear up, our heart will start racing. Sometimes our palms will get sweaty as our temperature changes, our muscles might tense. If you look at somebody that's having an intense emotion, their pupils will be quite dilated. So they sort of have that scaredy cat look. All of these things are our body's way of letting us know that it's alerted to something in the environment that we have to pay attention to. And if you think about that part of our brain being very, very primitive, often when it sensed danger, it would need to run, right? This body would need to run. And that's why so many systems are activated when we feel an emotion. Now, luckily, these days, we're not in constant danger of being, swallowed by a woolly mammoth, but we do still experience that same fight or flight when we have an intense emotion. So for us now, different than the caveman, the second part of our brain that becomes activated when we're having an emotional experience is this part of the brain here, which is the frontal cortex. So this part here. And that's kind of our thinking brain. If the amygdala is the feeling brain, then the frontal cortex is what we call the thinking brain. And that's where all of our executive functions lie: organization, planning, reason, logic. So if, like your computer, if you have too many programs open on your computer, you'll often get the sand dial or the spinning beach ball of doom. And that alerts you that the processing on the computer is not working because there's too many things going on. Our brain operates the same way. If our amygdala is really hot, dealing with something that it feels like is quite intense and dangerous or very, very pleasurable, our frontal cortex shuts down. Okay, we're not able to access that part of our brain that we can reason through. So this is why when you're talking to somebody that's having an intense emotional experience and you say, what are you thinking? Just relax, calm down. It's not that bad. You're asking the person to sort of reasonably look at the situation when they don't have that part of their brain online. Okay, so a lot of dealing with intense emotion is to cool down the amygdala in order for the frontal cortex to come back online. And that's often hard for people because a lot of times when we see somebody, or even if we're experiencing an intense emotion ourselves, we want to fix it. We want to stop it. It makes us uncomfortable. So we go into problem solving mode. And if you ever experience that when you try and problem solve with somebody that doesn't have problem solving ability in that moment, it often can accelerate or intensify the emotion. It's kind of like pouring gasoline on the fire. So really, one of the main ways that we manage intense emotions, anxiety being one of them, is by managing the amygdala first. And we're going to talk about more about that later. So that's just a little brief overview of how our brain works, and those two parts of the body, those two parts of the brain that are integral in our experiencing of emotions. Anthony, since I'm on my screen, I can't see any questions coming in. So could you just let me know if there are any? Because I'm not able, my technology ability is limited. So all I can see is my my screen. So
Of course, I'll monitor it, and if anything comes up, I'll let you know.
great. Thank you so much. Okay. So the age-old controversy of nature versus nurture, and the answer is yes, they are both very important in the development of us as human beings, and most particularly our personality structure. So I have these two Muppets here. We've got the green person and the orange person, and I wanted to talk about the two different biosocial models of personality. So let's take the green person. So the green person, if you think about measuring the level of intensity of an emotion between 0 and 10, that's the scale we usually use. And it's different for everybody. So my idea of a 1 in terms of intensity might be somebody else's 5. But generally, if you think about a scale of 0 to 10, the green person would start out their day, their baseline of intensity of emotion would be between a 0 and a 2, right? They're pretty calm. They're, all of their systems are relatively calm and not activated. And then something triggers that amygdala, and they are going to have an intensification of that emotion. And then it's going to peak, just like a wave, it's going to crest, and then it's going to subside. And throughout the day, this wave of emotional experience is going to happen. Sometimes it'll go up to a 3, sometimes it'll go up to a 5, but it's going to gradually have these calm waves throughout the course of the day. That's the emotional experience. And sometimes we're even experiencing, the amygdala could be experiencing something, and we're not even that aware of it. But that's what's happening in our brain throughout the course of the day for the green person. Now, given this scale of 0 to 10, when anybody gets to a 7 or above, that's when the amygdala takes over and that frontal cortex is going to shut down. So if you think about the green person, they've got a pretty big wiggle room between 0 and 7. So they've got a lot of ability to manage that emotional experience before they lose their ability to reason their way through it. Okay. The orange person has a bit of a different brain structure. The orange person has what we call a neuroatypical brain. That could mean they have something that is like an ADHD. They could have a mood disorder like anxiety or depression or bipolar. Something about their brain is atypical, not normal, right? And this is genetic. This is you're born with that. You don't have a lot of say in that. And we know that mood disorders particularly are hereditary. So if someone in your family, a mother or father, or even a grandmother or grandfather, have a mood disorder, your predisposition to having a mood disorder is increased. So they are hereditary. So the orange person's baseline, because of this atypical brain, is higher than the green person. So anecdotally, we find that their baseline is between a 4 and a 5. So if you think about that, the person that starts their day at a 5 doesn't have that same amount of wiggle room before they get to a 7. So it's much harder for them to manage their emotional experience while staying in that reasonable zone. So we call that higher baseline high sensitivity. And then what happens with the orange person is, instead of that gradual and gentle wave throughout the course of the day, they tend to spike pretty high and pretty fast. And we call that reactivity. So not only do they have sensitivity to those triggers, they also have high reactivity. And then once the orange person is up in that range between 7 and 10, it takes a lot longer for them to come down. So you see sort of a lingering mood or anxious state or depressed state when they get up to that level. And we call that slow return to baseline. So if you think about the green person, and again, this is genetic, this is their temperament, they're born with this. It's not like we choose to be a green person or an orange person. It's just what we're given, our nature. The environment, or the nurture piece, the environment responds much differently to the green person. Generally, they say, hey, you're okay, it'll be fine, not to worry, you've managed that well. They get a lot of feedback that tells them that they're doing okay. Thumbs up. The orange person, because of that high sensitivity and high reactivity, gets a very different message. They often get the message that they're a problem. Why are you so difficult? Why can't you just calm down? Everything is drama with you. They get much more negative feedback about their nature. And so they develop over time these sort of core beliefs that they're not doing okay. And so that's the nurture piece. So people with high sensitivity and high reactivity fight a tougher battle, not only because they have an atypical brain and they have to manage that, but because of the way that the environment responds to them. So we need to keep that in mind. And I think in our own families, it's really a great idea to know which you are. Are you a green person or an orange person? And very often, families will have a mixture of both. I know that's the case in our family. I have 2 kids, same gene pool, and one's a green from top to bottom, and one is an orange from top to bottom. And so being aware of that, we can all manage situations more effectively because we take into account high sensitivity and high reactivity. Okay. Any questions so far? Good. Okay. So I wanted to distinguish a little bit between stress and anxiety. We all experience stress. And in fact, some stress is okay. It actually can be motivating to keep us going. But stress is the sense that we've got a lot of demands on our plate and we don't feel necessarily like we're able to cope with them. Generally, we do with stress, but they can often feel overwhelming. Anxiety is when that feeling of not being able to cope is extended over days and weeks. And sometimes anxiety can appear without an actual stressor. Okay. So stress, totally natural. Anxiety, something to take care of. Okay. Both anxiety and stress lead to physical and mental symptoms such as insomnia, the inability to sleep, difficult concentrating, so that's sort of that brain fog, fatigue, muscle tension, digestive problems, anger, and irritability. And in teenagers, we find that the number one sign that stress has moved into anxiety is high irritability. So really kind of brittle, hard to talk to them, very reactive. That's when that's sort of a red flag for us as clinicians that we might be dealing with a mood disorder. These are just some ways that we see anxiety manifested at school. So for our school age kids, you see excessive worry, avoidance, so procrastination on projects, difficulty getting started on projects. Often kids won't hand things in even though they do the work. Perfectionism, difficulty concentrating. So anxiety can hijack the brain just like ADHD. So it's, that's the joy of working with children and adolescents, is we have to tease out which is just normal teenage behavior and what might be an indication of a mood disorder or a learning disability. Restlessness, test anxiety, social anxiety, and procrastination. So those are some of the ways that we see anxiety manifested in the school age kids. So when we're faced with a problem, the problem being the stressor, we have 5 options. And I think it's important for all of us to know that when we should go into problem solving mode and when we should sit back and deal with the emotion first before we go into problem solving. So if we are faced with a problem and it's a solvable problem, go for it. If you can solve a problem in that moment, then we would urge you to go ahead and do that. Problem solved. Okay? That's not often the case, that we have a problem that we can immediately solve, particularly if the problem is related to a relational issue. Okay. When another person gets involved in the problem or the situation or the stressor, we can't control the other person, so it makes the problems more difficult to solve. But if you can solve it, please go ahead and do it. Don't hesitate. Go ahead and do it. The second is to change the way that you feel about the problem. Now, this again may not be appropriate or easy to do because often our emotions are valid. What we're feeling is valid. If we are angry about something, if we are sad, if we feel guilty, often those are valid emotions for the problem. Now, we may be able to tone down the intensity of the emotion. We talked about that a little bit earlier, lowering the intensity of the emotion so that you could move into problem solving. But we don't ever want to invalidate or disprove any emotions that we're feeling before check the facts to see if they match the problem. We're going to skip over number 3 for a minute and then move into number 4. You can stay miserable. You can just get stuck in that doom loop of, why did this happen to me? It's not fair. This shouldn't have happened. Why is this a problem? And then we can move very quickly into making the problem worse. And that is by acting out problematic behaviors that don't have anything to do with the problem. And we all can do that very easily. We can pick fights, we can yell, we can throw things, we can go have a little bit too much to drink, we can get on Amazon and spend $100 just because that will make us feel better. We can just stop showing up for work because I have a problem and it's not solvable and it's not fair. All of these things that we can do that just make the problem worse. So number 1 and number 2 are the hardest and the most effective. Number 4 and number 5 are the easiest and the least effective. So often the neutral position of number 3 of just accepting the problem, at least for that moment, is the most effective thing that we can do. Okay. And acceptance doesn't mean that we're giving in or saying, yes, I deserve this problem and it's all my fault and I did it. That's absolutely not what acceptance is. Acceptance is saying, I've got a problem that I can't solve in this moment, and I can't change the way I feel about it because my emotions are valid. I am committed to not making the problem worse by acting out some other problem behaviors. So it's basically saying, I'm going to sit with this for this moment, not make the problem worse, and do what I need to do to get into a position where I can potentially solve the problem in another moment. Okay, so there is a question. Let me see if I can. Okay, what if you're so stressed or anxious that your judgment is skewed and you think you can solve what appears to be a simple problem, but it's actually something that requires more thought and should be tabled as opposed to being impulsively solved? That's a great question. Right. So if we're in that 7 to 10, we're not actually looking at things perhaps as reasonably as we could. So I think that if you're that stressed, it's probably not going to be easy to solve a problem. And I would say I would phone a friend at that point, or ask somebody that you're with, say, am I looking at this correctly? Is this actually a reasonable way to solve this problem? Okay, so solving the problem requires that your frontal cortex is online, because that way you can reasonably look at something and say that this is something to do. So if you're so stressed that you're in that, that non-frontal cortex being online state, probably not best to solve the problem. Now, here's the thing. A lot of times this comes into play when somebody else wants to act as your external frontal cortex. Parents do this a lot with kids. Kids will have a problem. They're in an emotional state. Parents will jump into that ring of fire and try and solve it for them. That's not the best thing to do either. Okay. The first thing that we want to do is manage the emotional experience. And then when the person can collaborate with you in problem solving, that's when you should move to problem solving. I hope that answered the question. Let me know if it didn't. Okay. All right. So what do we do if we're not moving into problem solving mode? What is the opposite of problem solving? And that is validation. And validation is very simply being able to answer the question, I understand what you're thinking, feeling, or doing in this moment. Okay. It's not condoning or saying, yes, go ahead. It's not total agreement. Sometimes you don't agree with something that you're validating, but you can understand why the person is thinking, feeling, or doing what they're doing. Okay. Now we want to be careful, and we only want to validate what is valid. Okay. So if we don't understand anything about what the person is experiencing, we can try and we can ask more questions to try and see if we can get there. But if there isn't an understanding of what somebody is thinking, feeling, or doing, we ought to stay out of validation. Okay. Not necessarily move into problem solving, but we don't want to validate something that's invalid. Okay. How do we validate? We listen to hear and not to respond. That's what we call active listening. So that's kind of what you're doing right now with me. So you're listening to hear me, and you're not in your mind formulating a response, because we're not having that kind of a dialogue. Often when we're talking to people, and you can do a little test of yourself, when you're listening to somebody talk, often we're in our minds thinking about what we're going to say back to them. You're missing a whole lot of information about what somebody is saying. So when somebody is highly emotional, we want to turn off that responding part of our brain, and we want to go into full listening mode, actively listening, just so we can understand, not so we can respond, not so we can problem solve, just so we can answer the question, do you understand? Okay. And if we are actively listening, we ought to be able to repeat back to them what they've said, not word for word. You don't have to parrot what they said, and you don't have to take notes so that you make sure that you get every word right, but basically be able to say to them, so it sounds like Susie made you really angry today at school. Is that right? And what that does, if we're able to repeat back to them what the person has said, is number one, it lets them know that we're listening and we're understanding, we're beginning to understand. And number two, it gives the other person an opportunity to hear what it is that they're saying. So they may say, no, that's not it. I wasn't angry at Susie at all. I was really scared because I didn't know what Susie was thinking. Ah, okay. Well, tell me more about that. So you got more information because you were repeating back what the person said. Number three is what we call a little bit of mind reading. So what I said was, so it sounds like you were angry with Susie today at school. The person that was talking to me may not have said that Susie did something to make them angry. So if I'm fully engaged in the conversation and I'm actively listening, I should be able to kind of gather from that what they might be feeling. Okay. And that is masterful if you can do that and hit the mark, right? And if you don't hit the mark, like my example, it's okay. You can say, great, tell me more, because I'm really, really trying to understand what you're going through. Okay. Number four is if what the person is experiencing is typical. So if you can answer the question, that would most people feel this way, you can let that person know, well, that makes sense that you were angry with that. I think most people would be angry with what Susie said, right? So if truly you can you can put this into the category of what we call normal or typical, then you can let the person know that. Now be careful. Some kids and adolescents like to think of themselves as wholly unique and the only ones that are experiencing what they're experiencing. And sometimes when we normalize or make typical what they're experiencing, it can feel dismissive. It's also the tone of voice that we use. So if we say something like, oh gosh, don't worry about that. Susie's a dime a dozen, people like her, they talk like that all the time. That can be experienced as very dismissive. So we want to make sure if we're putting it in the typical category, we're doing that with kindness in our tone and the way that we're talking. And I see another question. I'm just going to finish this and I'm going to get to the question. Number 5 is connecting the dots. So this is again, people really appreciate this. If you can say, gosh, this sounds like what Susie did to you a month ago. Does it feel like the same thing to you? because I feel like we had this conversation about a month ago when Susie did something very similar. Ah, that can feel so great when you know that somebody's holding your experiences in their mind. It's important enough for them to remember what you talked about. And again, that gets back to active listening. If we're really listening to understand, it gives our memory a whole lot more information that it can hold on to. And number 6 is what we call radical genuineness. We want the other person to know that even if they're having an intense emotion, we believe that they have the ability to manage it. And we're just there to support and validate, that we don't need to jump in and rescue them. That's a very understanding and accepting and nurturing way to be with somebody that's in emotion. You got this. I'm just here to support you. Let's see what we got. A couple questions. What if saying something is typical? Couldn't that be invalidating what you're saying? Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. It's basically, you want to make really sure that you're using the tone of voice that expresses that, wow, that makes sense to me, because I think most people would feel that way, right? So it's the tone of voice, the delivery, and really it's got to be something that can be globally interpreted as typical. Number 3 on your list, basically the same thing as being empathic. So validation is slightly different than empathic. Empathy is feeling with someone. So validating doesn't require that we actually feel the same way about something. It's more about understanding and expressing understanding. Empathy is when we're actually feeling with somebody. So it requires us to feel the same way about something. Okay, so slightly different. Empathy goes a long way. If we can feel with someone, and maintain that validating position, well, that's golden. But empathy isn't necessarily required for us to be able to validate. So it's a little more in our thinking brain that we're really actively listening so that we can understand. Okay, great questions. Keep them coming. Okay, so we have the opportunity to problem solve, and we move into problem solving when we have that reason mind, that thinking mind on board, okay? If we're in that amygdala area where the amygdala is taken over and we're sort of in that 7 to 10 zone, we want to step away and we want to think about maybe just validating with the person, just sitting with them, listening and expressing understanding. Okay, it goes a long way. And as we see that emotional intensity or that emotional temperature starting to come down, then we can venture into asking, what can I do to help? Again, if we're problem solving with someone else, we want to make sure that they are on board and we're doing it collaboratively and we're not taking over from them. Okay. Oops. All right. So there are some very basic physical phenomenon that we need to take care of that to help us manage our emotional intensity. And so there are some things that are, these are the things that our grandmothers and our mothers told us, but they still hold true. Sleep is one of the major things that can impact our mood state. And children need about 10 hours of sleep a night. Adolescents need 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night, and adults need 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. We are a sleep deprived nation. Many people do not get this much sleep. What I tell my adolescent clients that are staying up until midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, either on their phones or doing homework, or sometimes both, that you're not giving your brain the opportunity to work at its maximum efficiency. So turning off your phone and getting some sleep will actually help your grades more than staying up until 1 o'clock in the morning cramming. Okay. Phones in the bedroom, big no-no. Any screens, in fact, the blue light, even if your phone is turned over. If it's in the room, our brain can still get activated by a phone going off, even if the sound is off. They've done studies. And once that blue light turns our brain on, our brain goes into wake mode. Okay, so even if you're still sleeping, your brain is turned on and it's in wake mode. So we miss out on that REM sleep that we need to really be rested. So sleep is so, so, so important. And getting into a good sleep hygiene is crucial for us to be able to manage our stress and anxiety. I can't talk enough about sleep. We should be very, very, very protective of sleep. Eating a balanced diet, and this doesn't mean that we have to, eat only organic. It just means that we have to really monitor what we're putting into our bodies in terms of giving it the protein that it needs. This is the fuel for our car. And our bodies do not work as efficiently if we are eating inappropriately. So what we want to stay away from is eating too many carbs. We want to stay away from eating too much sugar. All of those things that can give us spikes and then crashes. Our mood is going to follow that. So if our body is doing that, our mind-body connection is crucial. So whatever your body is doing, your brain is going to follow. Likewise, whatever your brain is doing, your body is going to follow. So they talk. And we often talk about the gut or our stomachs as the second brain. So often people with chronic IBS or stomach problems, or kids that have stomach aches, it's usually related, at least in part, to anxiety or depression. Okay, so that mind-body connection. Exercise, we got to move our body. Again, this doesn't mean that you have to train for a marathon. It does mean we have to be active, because if we can move a muscle, we can change a thought. If we're sitting, our brain has a tendency to sit and stay on one thing and get into those doom loops. If we get up and move our body, our brain is going to follow. Mood altering drugs. This doesn't only mean, obviously, drugs that we would take to change our mood entirely. It also means caffeine, nicotine, sugar, or any medication that's taken not as prescribed. All of those can turn into mood altering drugs. Okay, so limiting the amount of caffeine that we have. This is just water in my Starbucks cup, so not to worry, but limiting it to 8 ounces a day, particularly if you are prone to anxiety, because caffeine is, again, it's just going to drive up the intensity of that anxiety. Physical illness, treating physical illness as soon as we are aware of it, not fighting through it. So if we need to take some medicine, if we have allergies during allergy season, making sure that we're taking the appropriate medicine. If we're prone to sinus infections or flu and cold season, getting vaccines if that's appropriate. All of these things are treating physical illness, not trying to fight through it. If we are feeling physically low, again, our mood is going to follow. So all of these things, if we don't attend to them, are going to increase the opportunity for anxiety to take over. Okay. We're almost done. So I wanted to talk about the concept of mindfulness. This is probably something that you've all heard about. It's kind of the hot thing right now, is mindfulness. Mindfulness is different than meditation. Meditation is great. I find meditation somewhat difficult to do. Mindfulness is being aware of where your mind is going at any time. Meditation is about clearing your mind. So mindfulness is much more active. It's really being in touch with where your mind is spending its time and being able to go with the flow of your mind. So if your mind wanders over here, follow your mind over there, spend a little time, and then being able to get your mind back on track to the thing that it needs to be doing in that moment. A lot of people say that they are great multitaskers. Well, you might be able to do multiple things at a time, but your brain is only going to focus on one of them. Okay, so the other thing might be something that you're doing rote that your mind doesn't really need to be participating in. But just know that if you're trying to do 2 things at one time, your brain is going to decide which one it wants to do. And usually that the default is it's going to pay attention to something again that is pleasurable or dangerous. Okay, so texting and driving, this is why it's so dangerous. Obviously, the phone is more pleasurable than driving down, I-95. So it is going to default to paying the most of its attention to the phone. That's why these things can be so dangerous. So mindfulness is about being aware of where your mind is spending the time and being able to go with the flow and bring it back to what you need to be doing. So doing one thing at a time and putting your mind and your body in the same place at the same time. This is really key in being able to manage anxiety. Distracting is one of the best ways that we can manage anxiety in that 7 to 10 moment. Distracting with throwing a ball back and forth with somebody, turning on a short YouTube video, 2 to 3 minutes, doing some jumping jacks, splashing some cold water on your face. Just these small bits of distracting of your mind so that you don't get stuck on that same thing. If all your mind is focusing on is that impending danger, your anxiety is going to shoot up. So giving your mind something else to focus on just for that one moment, your mind will follow. And again, the emotional intensity will go down. Doesn't mean that the stressor is going to go away with mindfulness. It just means that you're giving yourself the opportunity to manage that moment more effectively because you're getting out of that fight or flight mode and into a more reasonable part of your brain. Okay. Finally, just some thoughts that I want to leave with you. A thought is just a thought. It's not a fact. So any thought that we have, we generate ourselves. Okay. So just as easily as we can think those negative thoughts, we can think a positive thought. Okay. These are your thoughts. You can always come back to them at a later time if you need to do so. But if that thought is not serving you in that moment, put it in a box, put it on a shelf, close the door, and you can always get that box out later if you need to. But in that moment, it's best to put it away. Shutting out thoughts doesn't work. Observing a thought and letting it go is the key. Again, when you see your mind wandering, instead of beating yourself for wandering, follow that thought. Where is it going? It might give us some information about what's going on, maybe externally or internally. Follow it, observe it, decide whether that's someplace that you need to put some thought time. And if it isn't, then you move away to another thought. Okay. Our minds are made to wander. That's the beautiful thing about our minds. And if we try and stifle that creativity or that flow or that facility of our thoughts, it's going to come back to bite us. So really, the key to mindfulness is being able to navigate where our thought time goes and allowing time in your day to wander in your thoughts, taking a mental vacation. Okay, got another question here. How do you balance distracting yourself and ignoring the stressor altogether? Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Distracting is a short-term activity that gives our mind a chance to, again, move out of that amygdala and into more a reasonable mind. Short 2 to 3 minutes. When it goes longer than that, that's what we call avoidance. Okay. And when we're avoiding, we are neither managing our thought time, nor are we problem solving. So we want to stay out of avoidance. Avoidance, again, is one of the key characteristics of anxiety. And so we want to make sure that the distraction is short term. And again, the purpose of the distraction is to get the emotional temperature down so that we can more reasonably attack the problem at hand. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Any thoughts? Anything anybody wants to share with us tonight? Anthony, do you have any questions?
So we're going to start scheduling for in the next couple of months some more programs to kind of help de-stress. I know we're gonna be doing something for active listening as well with the community
Great.
mindfulness. Yeah, based at the community mindfulness programming on New Canaan. So they're gonna come and do something on active listening. We're going to have things that are geared towards teens only so that there will be a safe space for them to kind of just be on their own. And yeah, just keep looking for that. Sign up for the newsletter. Look on the website for the events and things will be coming. We have Zumba that we're going to be restarting again as well. And just things to kind of get you moving and your thoughts healthy and, just feeling good.
That's great. Yeah. Attending to those, any skills that we can get that some of these things, mindfulness can be kind of daunting. I know that when I was first being trained, I've tried to meditate and haven't been very good at it, although there's terrific apps out now to help us to meditate. Calm is an absolutely great app that you can put on your phone, and 2 minutes on the Calm app is a tremendous gift that you can give yourself every day. But Zumba, moving our physical body, anything that we can throw our minds and our bodies into is going to be helpful. So all of these programs that Ferguson is doing is just a real gift to the community.
Oh, thank you, Tracy. And somebody had asked if this will be available to watch afterwards. And yes, we did record it. It should be on our YouTube channel within the next day or so. So just give it about 24 hours and it'll be uploaded to the YouTube channel. And just as a reminder, when the Zoom closes out, a survey is going to pop up. So please do it. Please fill the survey out. It'll be really helpful to us. And it's required for our grantees. So please fill that out. It'll be really helpful. And Tracy, thank you so much for being with us. As always, you're wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Your presentations are great, and it does help us better manage our stress and anxiety with some coping mechanisms. So I really do appreciate you spending your evening with us.
Great. It's my pleasure. And good luck, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody. And thank you for tuning in.
Good night.